In the scorching heat of northern India, 1857, as the air shimmered under the relentless sun and dust rose in restless swirls across parade grounds, men and women were herded together, not as willing spectators, but as prisoners of fear. The British colonial administration had devised a spectacle meant not simply to extinguish the lives of rebels and dissenters, but to etch terror into the marrow of an entire civilization. This was not punishment in any ordinary sense. It was annihilation, ritualized in public, transformed into a theater of dread. The method was known as blowing from a gun. The condemned, often barefoot and trembling, would be dragged into the parade ground under armed guard. Before them stood a cannon, cold, unyielding, and grotesquely sanctified as an instrument of imperial justice. The executioner's art lay not in precision or speed, but in the unrelenting dramatization of power. The prisoner's arms and legs were bound tightly to the mouth of the cannon, their chest pressed against the cold iron barrel. Around them, hundreds of locals were forced to gather, compelled by soldiers who wielded bayonets not just against bodies, but against the very spirit of the people. Children clung to their mothers. Men looked on in helpless fury, knowing that even a whisper of protest could doom them to the same fate. When the command was given, the cannon roared, not with the thunder of war, but with the brutal intimacy of execution. The human body was torn apart in an instant, transformed into fragments that rained down upon the horrified audience. Flesh scattered on rooftops, fragments embedded in dirt walls, and blood stained the very soil that had for centuries been sacred to funeral rites. The dead were denied the dignity of burial, denied the rituals that bound communities together in faith and remembrance. It was not merely death, it was desecration. British officials, cold in their calculation, justified the practice as deterrence. The Governor-General Lord Dalhousie wrote in private correspondence that the sight was as terrible as it is impressive, precisely the effect we seek. His words reveal the chilling logic of colonial power. The purpose of punishment was not justice, but domination. Death was not the end point. It was the instrument by which fear was broadcast across provinces, villages, and generations. Eyewitness accounts convey the trauma with unbearable clarity. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Griffiths, stationed at the Delhi Ridge, described in his memoirs the execution of mutineers. The body was literally blown into thousands of pieces, fragments being found on the roofs of houses hundreds of yards away. The carnage was deliberate, the chaos of dismemberment carefully weaponized. British commanders would ensure that locals walked past the torn remains, fragments of humanity that clung to walls and scattered across market squares. Fear, after all, spread more effectively when its proof was unavoidable. In Jhansi, where the Rani of Jhansi had defied imperial authority with fiery courage, British officers timed these executions to coincide with bustling market days. Stalls were emptied, spices left to rot, silks abandoned as traders, and townspeople were corralled into the square. What should have been a day of life and commerce turned instead into a theatre of death. Witnesses later recalled how silence followed the cannon's roar, not just silence of speech, but the silence of a people whose voices had been stolen by horror. The poet Mirza Ghalib, writing in his diary, lamented that the city has become a slaughterhouse, where death comes not from the sword, but from the roar of devils made of iron. His words captured the essence of this punishment. It was mechanized death, an imported technology of terror that cut through both flesh and faith. But this was not a purely British invention. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb had ordered its use against religious dissenters, and Persian armies under Nadir Shah had employed it during their invasions. Yet under British rule, it was perfected into systematized terror. Where once it had been the exceptional cruelty of despots, now it became policy, written into the manuals of colonial discipline. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 provided the perfect stage for its escalation. On one chilling day in Paswa, 40 rebels were executed, each death staggered to extend the torment of spectators. At Calcutta, 24 men were obliterated within the span of 2 hours. Records show that between 200 and 300 locals were forced to attend each execution, their attendance documented in registers as though fear could be quantified, as though trauma could be tallied like grain or salt. In the bazaars of Delhi and Lucknow, mothers would hush unruly children with whispered warnings about the demon cannon. Folklore absorbed the horror, embedding the memory into lullabies, songs, and oral histories. The trauma outlived the empire itself, shaping cultural memory long after the last cannon blast echoed across Fatehgarh in 1859. The British justified this brutality with chilling bureaucratic logic. Sir John Lawrence argued that normal modes of execution were insufficient in India, framing entire peoples as fanatics who required extraordinary methods. Cost-effectiveness was even cited in administrative reports. A quarter charge of powder was sufficient to destroy a body, cheaper than the ammunition of battle. And yet beneath this cold arithmetic lay the true motive. The destruction of the body denied sacred rites, severing the bridge between the living and the dead. In Hindu and Muslim traditions alike, the proper handling of the dead was vital to the soul's journey. To obliterate a body was to obliterate a family's hope, to shatter a community's faith. The historian Ranajit Guha would later call this dominance without hegemony, the reliance on violence so spectacular, so visceral, that it bypassed persuasion altogether. It was rule through fear, naked and unadorned. Yet paradoxically, each cannon blast sowed seeds of resistance. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, writing in 1909, reflected that every blast of their cannons planted seeds of liberation in our hearts. Songs of lament from Amritsar transformed into rallying cries for revolutionaries. Terror had its price, for the very brutality that cowed some hearts steeled others. By 1859, the practice faded, but its shadow lingered. The final executions at Fatehgarh silenced the last embers of rebellion, yet the memory of those torn bodies refused to die. Across villages, across generations, people told and retold the horror as though to remind themselves of what empire truly meant. Not governance, not justice, but a cold cannon's roar tearing through human flesh. And so, blowing from a gun became emblematic of British colonial rule in India, a policy of spectacle, a theatre of blood. It was the empire stripped bare, its civilizing pretenses burned away by the fire of a cannon, revealing the machinery of domination beneath. It was not merely punishment, it was the ritual performance of supremacy, written in fragments of bone and echoes of screams. Hell on earth, Australia's penal colonies of despair. When Britain looked upon its crowded prisons in the late 18th century, bursting with thieves, debtors, and political dissenters, the government sought not reform, but exile. The answer came in the form of distant lands, a vast unknown continent across oceans, imagined as both dumping ground and deterrent. Thus, in 1788, the First Fleet sailed to Botany Bay, carrying not pioneers but convicts, not settlers, but the damned. What unfolded in the penal colonies of Australia would become one of the greatest experiments in punishment the world has ever witnessed. A hell designed not merely to cage the body, but to crush the spirit. From the outset, the voyage itself was punishment. Men and women were crammed into the dark holds of prison ships, chained to wooden beams, their skin rubbed raw by iron shackles. The stench was unbearable, a mixture of vomit, sweat, disease, and despair. Surgeons wrote that the air below deck could knock down a horse, a phrase so often repeated it became shorthand for the voyage's inhumanity. Aboard the infamous ship Neptune in 1790, nearly a third of convicts perished before landfall. Those who survived staggered ashore emaciated, coughing, eyes hollowed by months without sunlight, and what awaited them was no relief. The Australian bush, dense, alien, and filled with strange sounds. was transformed into an open-air prison. At Port Arthur, Norfolk Island and Macquarie Harbour, the British forged penal settlements where cruelty was elevated to policy. Commandants declared openly that suffering was the point. Transportation, Judge S. Francis Forbes once said, is a slow death, a death of the soul first, then of the spirit, and finally of the body. On the rugged Tasman Peninsula, surrounded by cold seas patrolled by sharks, rose the most infamous of all, Port Arthur. Established in 1833, it was designed not simply to hold prisoners, but to unmake them. Isolation was the tool. The separate system, imported from England, was pushed to its cruelest extremes here. Prisoners were forced into tiny solitary cells, forbidden even the comfort of sound. When they exercised, they wore hood-like leather masks, called beaks, to ensure no man saw another's face. Some inmates spent years without hearing their own voices because silence was imposed as rigorously as iron. The chaplain, Reverend William Althorne, noted bitterly, "The separate system produces either madness or destruction of the intellectual faculty." He was right. Men emerged from their cells unable to string sentences together, their minds reduced to fragments by endless solitude. The model prison at Port Arthur, completed in 1853, became a monument to psychological torture. A prison designed like a church, its very architecture forced penitence. Yet there was no redemption here, only slow unraveling. Diaries from inmates speak of hallucinations, voices in the dark, and despair so profound that suicide became preferable to survival. If Port Arthur was meant to break the mind, Norfolk Island was designed to break the body. Located 1,000 miles into the Pacific, it was a place so remote that even rumours of its horrors terrified convicts in England. Hell on earth, John Mitchell, an Irish political prisoner, called it, where men are flogged until their backs resemble raw meat. The regime was sadism institutionalized. Commandant James Morissette, who ruled from 1829 to 1834, took pride in his cruelty. Men were lashed for the smallest infractions, 50, 100, sometimes 200 strokes of the cat o' nine tails. Overseers laughed as blood sprayed across stone yards. The flagellator Robert Flogger Whiting became notorious for his efficiency. With each calculated swing, he could peel skin away until bone glistened in the sun. Convicts knew that to murder was often to escape. In 1832, 12 prisoners drew straws to determine who would kill whom, knowing that the murderer would be hanged swiftly and mercifully, while the others would remain to endure endless torment. Charles Rutley lost and was killed, his murderer walking to the gallows relieved, even grateful. Such was the logic of Norfolk Island, that death became a gift. Governor Ralph Darling, after visiting in 1827, described the island as a place of the worst description where the vilest practices prevail. But it was not just vileness, it was policy. Men were chained in irons weighing up to 24 pounds, forced to quarry stone until their hands bled, or wade chest-deep into freezing water to haul timber until their legs rotted from rusted shackles. Punishment in the colonies was never random. It was structured cruelty, calculated to maintain control. A man who stole bread might receive 50 lashes. A prisoner who struck an officer could face 200. His body torn into ribbons, the dreaded treadmill, an endless wheel climbed by 16 men at once, forced convicts to walk the equivalent of a mountain each day, collapsing from exhaustion only to be dragged back on. More feared still was the box, a coffin-like cell where prisoners stood upright in darkness for days, deprived of movement, food, and air. One man, after 3 days inside, emerged unable to walk, his body locked into rigidity. At Macquarie Harbour, men waded into icy rivers, chopping Huon pines while chains rusted into their flesh. Their legs rotted until amputation was the only cure. Overseers declared coldly that a dead convict is better than a malingering one. Food itself became a weapon. Rations consisted of rancid salted meat, weevil-riddled bread, and thin soup. Prisoners hunted rats for sustenance, trading them like currency. William Thompson, a convict at Port Arthur, wrote that a fat rat was worth 2 days' rations. When rations were cut further on Norfolk Island in 1844, men rioted with their cooking pots as weapons. The uprising was crushed with musket fire, 12 dead, 26 hanged in retribution. Disease thrived in the colonies. Dysentery, scurvy, and typhoid killed faster than the lash. In cramped workshops designed for 100 but filled with 500, mortality soared to nearly 40% in a single year. Doctors recorded backs eaten alive by flogging, legs consumed by infection, and men reduced to skeletons before age 30. Surgeon James Peyton once described flogging a prisoner unconscious, the whip striking raw muscle where skin no longer existed. The psychological toll was equally profound. Men spoke of hearing phantom voices at night, of madness spreading like a contagion. Captain Alexander Maconochie, one of the few reformers, described convicts as a special class of desperate men, driven to the edge of their humanity. His attempts to introduce rewards for good behavior were swiftly rejected. Too lenient, said authorities who believed suffering was the true purpose of transportation. Yet, in the depths of cruelty, defiance flickered. At Sarah Island in 1834, convict James Porter and 9 others staged one of the most daring escapes in history. They hijacked a ship they themselves had built and sailed it over 1,000 miles to Chile, vanishing into legend. Others became bushrangers, outlaws who turned the Australian wilderness into a battleground. Matthew Brady, once a convict at Macquarie Harbour, escaped in 1824 and roamed for 2 years with his gang, robbing the rich, earning a reputation as a folk hero. These stories unsettled colonial authorities, for they revealed that even the harshest punishments could not fully extinguish the human desire for freedom. Yet, for every successful escape, hundreds died in chains, their names lost to ledgers, their bones buried in shallow graves. The penal colonies reshaped Australia itself. Roads, buildings, and bridges were carved out by convict labour, the very infrastructure of the colony built on backs scarred by the lash. But the convict stain endured. Generations born from transported men and women carried the stigma of criminality, even when innocent. Free settlers sneered at emancipists, refusing them work, their children branded currency lads and lasses, forever marked by bloodlines of punishment. The system's brutality also reshaped indigenous lands. Convict labour cleared forests, built settlements, and displaced Aboriginal communities, fueling conflicts that scarred the continent. The empire expanded on the suffering of both transported convicts and dispossessed peoples. By the mid-19th century, opposition to transportation grew. Critics in both Britain and Australia declared that a nation could not be founded on chains. The final convict ship, Hougoumont, arrived in 1868 carrying Irish political prisoners. It marked the end of an 80-year experiment in cruelty, but the ruins of Port Arthur still stand, its silent cells heavy with memory. Norfolk Island, lush and deceptively beautiful, remains haunted by the cries of men long gone. The Australian penal colonies embodied the empire's philosophy of punishment, that suffering itself was the foundation of control. In the words of one commandant, to break a man's spirit, you must first break his hope. For tens of thousands, that was the empire's legacy, not redemption, not reform, but despair sculpted into stone and silence. The captain's daughter, flogging across the empire. In the great age of sail, when wooden ships cut across oceans under the Union Jack, the British Empire's reach depended upon discipline, harsh, immediate, and absolute. Discipline on land, in barracks and parade grounds. Discipline at sea, aboard cramped warships rolling endlessly across grey waters. And the instrument that symbolized this iron rule was not the musket, nor the cannon, nor even the gallows. It was the whip. the dreaded cat o' nine tails. To the British soldier or sailor, the cat was more feared than the enemy. Known grimly as the captain's daughter, it was no figure of affection, but of terror. 9 knotted cords of waxed hemp, each designed to tear into flesh, were fastened to a short wooden handle. When swung by the boatswain's mate or regimental flogger, it could strip skin from the back in ragged layers, exposing muscle beneath. The sound it made was unforgettable, a hiss through the air, followed by the sickening crack of cord meeting flesh. The flogging was never private. It was theatre, and every detail was orchestrated to remind men of their powerlessness beneath authority. At sea, the entire crew was summoned. They gathered on deck, forming a silent circle around the mainmast. The articles of war were read aloud, dry legal words that suddenly took on life and death immediacy. The condemned man was stripped to the waist, bound spread-eagle to a grating, his skin pale in the morning light. The surgeon stood ready not to comfort but to measure survival. He judged how many lashes a body might endure before collapsing into unconsciousness or death. The flogger stepped forward, whip in hand, and then came the first strike. Witnesses describe how even hardened sailors turned pale at the sound, how the deck fell silent except for the victim's cries and the relentless rhythm of the whip. Lieutenant William Robinson, aboard HMS Favourite in 1829, wrote in his diary, "Even the hardiest sailors turned pale at the sound of the drummer's call to punishment. The cat wrote its name across the man's back, letter by letter, stroke by stroke." On land, the army staged floggings with similar spectacle. At parade grounds across Britain, Ireland and the colonies, regiments gathered in ordered ranks. The punishment was delivered in front of civilians as well, who often turned out in large numbers. For some, it was grim entertainment. For others, it was a sobering lesson. Women of high society even watched from carriages. Discipline was not just enforced on soldiers' backs, it was inscribed into the very fabric of imperial life. Naval records show how deeply embedded flogging was in military culture. On HMS Victory in 1805, just months before Trafalgar, 127 floggings were recorded in a single year, an average of 3 per week. On HMS Eurotas in 1820, Admiral John Phillimore's logs note a boy of 12 receiving 12 lashes for dropping a marlinspike. On HMS Macedonian, punishments for silent contempt or drunkenness ranged from a dozen lashes to several dozen more. The lash was as common as salt spray and often more dreaded. The historian N.A.M. Roger described it as the currency of naval discipline. Infractions as small as neglecting to salute, dozing on watch, or spilling rum could warrant dozens of lashes. The severity lay not only in the pain of the moment, but in the scars that lasted for life, raised welts, cross-hatched patterns, backs permanently marred with the Empire's handwriting of control. The Army's regulations were, if anything, even harsher. Up to 1,000 lashes could legally be imposed for grave offences such as mutiny or striking a superior, though few men survived such sentences. More common were punishments of 200 or 300. Surgeons intervened when men collapsed, but this was not mercy, it was efficiency. Soldiers were property of the Crown, and their deaths wasted investment. One infamous case was that of Private James White of the 7th Fusiliers, sentenced in 1831 to 300 lashes for striking a sergeant. After 200, his body was so destroyed that the surgeon called a halt. White survived, but only as a scarred husk, his spirit broken. What made flogging so devastating was not simply the physical torment, but its psychological weight. It was public humiliation, staged before peers who could do nothing but watch. It was a reminder that the body belonged to the Empire and that rebellion would be inscribed in pain. Sailor Samuel Leach, recalling a flogging on HMS Macedonian, wrote, "The sound of the cat falling upon the bare back of my shipmates rings in my ears even now. Their screams echo still in my dreams." Some men fainted before the lash touched them, collapsing from terror alone. Others bore it in stoic silence, their faces masks of defiance, yet even they carried the trauma within. Doctors of the time observed what they called nervous fever after flogging, trembling, nightmares, sudden outbursts, or blank submission. Some men emerged from punishment docile, broken. Others became uncontrollably violent, their minds warped by the memory of pain. Suicide attempts were common, sometimes within days of the flogging. The lash, then, was not only about discipline. It was a machine for manufacturing obedience through trauma. It crushed individuality and molded soldiers and sailors into instruments of empire. By the 1830s, reformers began to question the morality of flogging. Humanitarians, churchmen, and even some officers condemned it as barbaric. Newspapers published accounts of sailors who died after lashings, igniting public outrage. Parliament debated the practice. Some officers argued it was essential to maintain order, claiming that without the lash, mutiny would spread. Others pointed to commanders who abolished flogging on their ships and still maintained discipline through rewards and respect. Captain Edward Pelham Brenton of HMS Spartan famously ran his ship for 3 years without a single flogging, achieving one of the lowest desertion rates in the Mediterranean fleet. Admiral Sir William Hall declared that flogging created more cowards than it ever prevented. Yet the practice lingered, clung to by tradition and the stubborn belief that pain equaled discipline. It was only in 1879 that the Naval Discipline Act limited flogging to cases of mutiny. In 1881, the Army Discipline and Regulation Act formally abolished it altogether. The last recorded naval flogging occurred in 1881 aboard HMS Thetis, when a seaman received 24 lashes for striking an officer. It marked the end of over 2 centuries of sanctioned brutality. The cat-o'-nine-tails now rests in museums, frayed cords in glass cases, dark stains preserved like relics. They are reminders of how the empire maintained order not by loyalty or love, but by fear etched into skin. The whip did not just shape soldiers and sailors, it shaped the empire itself. Admiral Lord Fisher, reflecting in 1919, wrote, "The cat-o'-nine-tails built the empire, but it was the empire's shame that made us put it away." His words capture the paradox. The lash was both a tool of power and a mark of disgrace, an emblem of how far Britain's rule depended upon cruelty masquerading as discipline. And for the men who endured it, the scars never faded. They carried the empire on their backs, literally, scars crossing scars, a map of pain written across flesh. Discipline, yes, but also domination, humiliation, and despair. Branded, broken, and exiled, punishments that haunt the empire. The British Empire was not held together by diplomacy alone, nor even by bayonet and cannon. It endured through fear, fear enforced by punishments that reached every corner of its dominions. Some were spectacular, like the roar of the cannon in Delhi or the crack of the cat on a sailor's back. Others were quieter, insidious torments that marked flesh, starved bodies, or confined minds. Together, they formed a global language of cruelty, one that spoke across continents in scar tissue and silence. Nowhere was the cruelty of imperial punishment more visible than in the plantations of the Caribbean. For enslaved Africans, the law was not written in ink, but in scars. Runaways faced a range of horrors, ears sliced off, noses cut away, even limbs amputated, to ensure no escape would ever be attempted again. Branding with hot irons was routine. A single R for runaway might be seared into a shoulder. Repeat offenders were branded multiple times, their bodies turned into maps of pain. Colonial codes in Jamaica and Barbados listed such punishments with bureaucratic precision, as though mutilation were as ordinary as taxation. A runaway caught a second time might be hanged, a third time burned alive. One planter wrote with chilling frankness, "A slave once marked is a slave forever." For masters, the mutilated body was a warning to others. For the enslaved, it was a living death, a stripping away of dignity and humanity. In West Africa, Similar punishments were inflicted on those resisting colonial authority. Rebels were sometimes paraded through villages with amputated hands, a grotesque display meant to break the will of entire communities. The British claimed it was justice. In truth, it was the Empire's trademark, turning flesh into spectacle. If Australia's penal colonies represented one experiment in suffering, the Andaman Islands were another. After the Great Rebellion of 1857, Britain sought a place to exile the most dangerous resistors, a place beyond sight, beyond hope. They found it in the Bay of Bengal, a cluster of islands surrounded by treacherous seas. Here rose the infamous cellular jail of Port Blair, soon nicknamed Kalapani, the Black Waters. To cross the ocean itself was already punishment. For Hindus, it was spiritual pollution. Crossing the Black Waters meant losing caste, severing ties with family and faith. The voyage thus destroyed not only bodies, but identities. Once in Port Blair, prisoners entered a world of silence and chains. The cellular jail, completed in 1906, was a panopticon of torment, 7 wings radiating from a central watchtower, hundreds of solitary cells designed to enforce isolation. Political prisoners, many of them poets, teachers, and revolutionaries, were shackled, gagged, and beaten. Forced labor was relentless, crushing coconut shells, pulling oil presses like beasts of burden, or digging roads through mosquito-infested swamps. Food was scarce, water foul, tropical diseases swept through the prison. Men collapsed under heat, shackled to their work, left to die in mud and filth. The very architecture of the jail ensured despair. No prisoner could see another, their only companion, the echo of their own thoughts. For Indians, the Andamans became a byword for exile worse than death. Families spoke of loved ones swallowed by the Black Waters. The jail's ruins still stand today, a grim monument to how empire turned isolation into a weapon as sharp as any whip. If flogging was the Navy's staple, darker punishments still haunted the decks of British ships. Among them was keel hauling, a punishment borrowed from earlier naval traditions. A sailor accused of grave offences might be tied with ropes, thrown overboard, and dragged beneath the ship's barnacled hull. The result was predictable: deep lacerations, broken bones, and often drowning. Though officially rare by the 18th century, accounts suggest it lingered unofficially into the early empire. Sailors whispered of it with dread, calling it the captain's last resort. More common were lesser but still brutal torments, being started or whipped with the end of a rope, being lashed to the mast in the blazing sun, or being confined to irons in the bilge, surrounded by filth and rats. These punishments were not designed to kill, only to remind sailors that life itself could be worse than death. Even as Britain projected itself as a modern empire, it carried forward some of the medieval world's most grotesque practices. In Ireland and Scotland, rebels against the crown could be sentenced to the ancient punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The condemned would be hanged until near death, cut open, their entrails burned before their eyes, then dismembered, their parts displayed on city gates as warnings. By the late 18th century, such punishments were increasingly rare, yet they endured just long enough to remind subjects of the crown's merciless reach. For many, the memory of these grisly displays merged seamlessly into the new punishments of empire, proof that cruelty was not a departure, but a continuation. Within Britain itself, prisons developed punishments that were exported to the colonies. Chief among them was the treadmill. Installed in penitentiaries from Pentonville to Bermuda, the treadmill was a massive wooden wheel that prisoners climbed endlessly, step after step, hour after hour. Unlike mills that ground grain, these treadmills produced nothing. Their purpose was exhaustion, punishment for its own sake. Convicts might climb the equivalent of thousands of feet each day, collapsing in sweat and despair. Silence was enforced. Talking meant more hours. Resting meant the lash. To prisoners, it was a torment of futility, labor stripped of meaning, a metaphor for empire's philosophy that suffering was its own justification. Branding with hot irons, once a medieval punishment, persisted far into the imperial age. Convicts in Britain were branded with letters like D for deserter, T for thief, or F for felon. In the colonies, branding was inflicted on both transported convicts and enslaved labourers. Flesh became parchment, scar tissue the empire's permanent ink. In the Caribbean, runaways bore multiple brands, each one recording an attempt at freedom. Some bodies carried half a dozen letters, a grotesque biography written in fire. Branding was meant to make escape futile. For how could a branded man or woman ever vanish in a world where scars spoke louder than words? Taken together, these punishments reveal a common thread. Whether in India, Australia, the Caribbean, or aboard ship, the British Empire sought to enforce obedience not just through laws and armies, but through the systematic breaking of bodies and spirits. Punishment was spectacle, deterrence, humiliation, annihilation. The poetical justifications of civilizing missions crumble when set against the cat-o'-nine tails. The cannons roar, the branding irons hiss. These were not tools of justice, they were tools of empire, tools designed to remind the subject that they were never free, never safe, never beyond reach. And so, the empire endured, not only on trade and industry, but on the bodies of the punished, the voices of the silenced, the scars of the enslaved. Today, ruins remain. The shattered walls of Port Arthur, the cells of the Andamans, the iron treadmills rusting in forgotten prisons. They stand as silent witnesses, whispering the truth that power maintained by cruelty carries its own doom. For empires built on fear may last centuries, but the memory of their brutality lasts longer still.